My guest today is Bernadette Spofforth.
There's so much to talk about
Yeah.
in the UK, isn't there? Because we're
Yeah,
completely screwed and you've set yourself free.
we have. Yeah. There's been this vibe shift that Peter Ridd talked about on my podcast. I think it's a real thing. It seems different now than it was in November 1 or so.
And I think Britain is entering its peak Canada phase
Yeah.
where you can't say anything. People are actually genuinely frightened to speak. They don't know what they're allowed to talk about, what they're not allowed to talk about. And you get some really brave people. Some of our journalists are very brave and they do just say things. But the majority of them, particularly those employed by the mainstream media, are just towing this really random line where they won't talk about anything that normal citizens want to talk about.
Do you think it's at kind of a peak right now in Britain? Or are there any signs that it's going the other way where free speech is coming back or not?
Oh, no. Oh, no, we're at the beginning. This is going to get much, much, much worse. I mean, there are reports this morning that the Home Office commissioned a report, and that report has recommended the government come down on extremists even more. And those extremists, as detailed in this report, are people who talk about alleged grooming gangs. Well, they're not alleged, but that would make you far right. And that Islamic extremist behavior in the UK is just spread by the right wing. And the two-tier policing, if someone says that the police have double standards, then that is extremist. So they're getting far, far, far harder on the population.
So let's talk maybe about your experience as an alleged extremist. It says if this is true behind you, and I think it's all related to that experience.
Yeah, I copied and pasted a post just after the attacks in Southport, and it wasn't the best tweet I've ever made. It wasn't the best decision I've ever made. Mostly, it turns out it was true. But at the time, of course, it was blamed for the riots all over the country. And a very hard left part of X likes to attack people. And I'm not often attackable simply because I do tend to do my homework quite well. But in this particular instance, I didn't. I put the tweet out and I left the room. And they attacked me and they consistently sent what I'd posted to the police until the police turned up at my door. And of course, I was very convenient. I was a very convenient hit for the government. I was a very convenient hit for the CPS because I wasn't what they termed a right-wing thug. Here was just someone who'd been a consistent and persistent thorn in their side for years. And they could shut me up, right?
And I guess they did for a while.
Yeah, they did. And it was the most debilitating and destroying experience of my entire life. And I've talked about it a couple of times with a couple of journalists only. But the incredible destruction of your life within a few days by a media who didn't really believe what they were doing, but felt they had to, because that's the government line, was completely horrendous. And they held me like a terrorist for 36 hours in a prison cell. And you know, maybe it would be different now if they arrested me, because now I have nothing to lose. I lost it all. And only when you've lost it all are you truly free, right? Because free speech is not free. In the UK, it costs you money, and it will cost more and more and more, which is why so many people are so silent.
So they tried to silence you, but now you're just your X feed is just on fire all the time. I'm totally loving it. You're speaking out. You're very influential, and I'm very impressed with what you're doing. That must feel good now to just let it rip.
No, because
No.
I am much more restrained now than I was before. So what I tried to do was stay away from subjects where I might be arrested again. And that probably makes me a coward. But I tend to stay away from things where I would be considered an extremist. Only the problem now is that denial of net zero also makes you an extremist, right? So I'm probably going to get arrested again.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I am so interested in net zero, and you're pushing back so hard against it. I'm totally loving it. But you think that you might get into legal trouble possibly, or they might come knocking at your door over that, do you think?
Well, if you look at what the EU has done and what Ofcom, who's been put in charge of our online safety and misinformation, have done, it looks pretty likely that exposing hypocrisy will be considered misinformation, and misinformation or disinformation will be considered illegal in this country, and the posts will be removed, or you could be in some kind of trouble. If somebody is offended by some of the things I write about net zero, then they could report me to the police and say they were deeply offended because I'm a denier, and that would get me a non-hate crime number, which any employer in the future could access and see that I had been in trouble with the police.
So, among the public in your country, what are they thinking about this crazy government censorship? They are supporting you, aren't they, or are they not?
I think that the time for the silent majority is over, and it's over in the UK. And I think that what happened to me and to others really galvanized the public into being absolutely horrified. So the mass public are beginning to make their voices heard. The problem is that for a long time, for many years, our media has been dominated by the minority, by the good people, by the virtue, by the very hard left. And the problem we have is that those are the voices that are the loudest. Those are the voices that are in our institutions. They're the voices teaching our children. They're the voices lecturing in our universities. And I always remember a few years ago after Brexit, I had a really lovely conversation with a very eminent university professor. And he was a lovely bloke. And I just met him at some, I don't know, we were out at some do. And he admitted to me very quietly that he had voted for Brexit, but he couldn't tell anybody in his university because he would be fired.
So I'm curious, how much power does the BBC or the legacy media have in the UK right now? Are they still kind of all powerful, or are people saying, screw you, I'm going to get my news from X and social media?
Yeah, I think more and more people are saying screw you. So about a year and a half ago, I think X had about 17% of the UK population had an account. And now I think the figure is much higher at about 60% of the adult population have an account. So it is pretty obvious that the tide is turning. And if you look at the mass media, they are in quite considerable financial trouble because, of course, people aren't buying the newspapers. They're getting their news online. And I think one of the reasons that the mainstream media have come down so hard on the side of the government is that they hope if they pull that party line, they will be funded in this transition where online news becomes very, very censored. And the outcome of all of that will be the only place you can get your news from is, of course, the legacy media. I think that's what many of them are hoping, is that the tide will turn, Ofcom will support them, and the mass public will galvanize back to what is essentially government propaganda.
So that makes me very optimistic, what you just said about the public going to X. That to me sounds huge. And I think this whole woke mind virus, it can't last if there's free speech on X and people are going to X and getting their news there.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what the government in the UK thinks. I think, and I think a lot of people, I don't know what the percentage would be, but a lot of people do believe that in order to keep their children safe, things like X must be suppressed. The problem is that that's a very difficult thing to do when you give all of that power to Ofcom, who are very less leaning. I mean, the woman who runs Ofcom is on the board of the WEF. How can you possibly have somebody unbiased when they've got their toe in that water? And what will happen, I think, is that more and more people will be censored by these non-hate crimes, but non-criminal hate crimes, and anything else the government could do to try and suppress the news online. I think they will try and do.
Yeah, I'm curious exactly how the logistics of that would work. They can censor people like you. They can put you in jail or whatever if you're in Britain. But people still can get their news from other folks that are not in jail that are outside of Britain, right? Is there some way they can?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think they'll be successful,
Yeah.
but I think it will be painful. I think it will be painful for lots of people to hold their line. So, for example, I know of an anonymous account on X. It's a good account. Sometimes it posts rubbish and sometimes it posts great stuff, right? But that is that person's absolute prerogative. It is their absolute prerogative. They do it in their free time. I have never known this account to be aggressive. I've never known this account to troll anybody or be rude in any way. But their employer called them in after a whistleblower had said they had been spreading misinformation on X, and they're going to lose their job. They're going to lose their job for something they have done without mentioning their employer, without even posting in their own name. They will lose their job because the employer doesn't like their opinion.
So do you think a person like that is still sort of alone without the support of other folks? Or are other people, other free speech advocates speaking out and saying this is crazy?
Yes, I think there are lots of them, but they'll only speak out and say they're crazy until they lose their job, right? Because most people don't realize how on the edge they are. They haven't read their terms and conditions. They haven't read their employee handbook. And as I've said to so many people since my ridiculous arrest, is you have to join the Free Speech Union in the UK, because that is the only way where you are even a little bit protected, because they will pay for your legal advice. They will help you with your employer when you're going through, this whole disciplinary process for not agreeing with the narrative. That's genuinely happening in this country, genuinely happening.
How about Elon Musk himself? If he posted in detail, I don't know if he has yet about this, about your case even, and getting 50 million views on it, and helping the people in the wider world understand how crazy it is. Wouldn't that help a lot?
Yeah, and it is helping. I think that is helping. But you have to remember that we have a government, and we have in Keir Starmer somebody absolutely rigid, absolutely rigid. It's his way or no way. And so I think that they really believe they can crush dissent. They can shut everybody up, and then everybody will be happy because we'll all have this great country where everybody loves each other. There are no rape gangs. There's no crime. There's no knife crime, because you can't buy a knife because they won't let you buy them on Amazon anymore. And isn't life lovely? I honestly think that they believe that if they close people like me down, everybody else would be happy.
Do you think their dream is to close X down so you just can't get to X at all from Britain?
Oh, they'd love to. I think they would genuinely love to. They can't, but I think they would genuinely love to. And, we've got 4 more years of this. And what troubles me about even the US is that I think a lot of these plans have been in place for a very long time. They're just being exposed now by people like me, people like you. Normally, they would never be reported on. And my concern is that the US only has 4 years, right? You've got 4 years of Trump. Unless you get someone of a similar vein then this was just a bump in the road, just like Boris Johnson was just a bump in the road, just like the government considers Brexit was just a bump in the road. Be fine, we'll be back soon, because these plans are laid over 50 years and 100 years, right? They don't care about the short-term issue. And that does trouble me a lot, is that you think you're free, but how much can he do in 4 years? You might need 12 years to fix what's happening.
Do you think this craziness is coming from inside Britain, or somehow it's being forced from the top, from the WEF, the UN, all that type of those higher level people?
I think it was forced to start with.
Yeah.
But, you know, if it started 50 years ago and the infiltration was nice and slow and steady, then you have a great deal of work to do to undo all of that. You know, if in the UK, something like they did a poll, no one believes any polls, right? But let's just say we give this a measure of consideration. Something like 50 or 60% of under 25-year-olds in the UK believe they would be better off if we had a dictatorship and not a democracy. Well, if you look at what's happening within governments, if you do believe your government has been infiltrated by NGOs and organizations who are even writing toolkits, you know, our government in the UK adopts toolkits written by external, non-elected organizations. And if they're adopted, then that's what our children are being taught. And if our children are being taught in school that you can have 100 genders and that democracy is bad and that free speech is bad, then that's the generation you're bringing up, and that will take a long time to change. Now, having said that, I believe there's a lot of overhype about these things, and that the majority of under 25-year-olds probably want free speech, freedom, and democracy, and to live their lives how they want. I believe they do. But they're too scared. They're too scared. Britain reminds me of Canada during lockdown. That's what I feel we're in, a free speech lockdown.
So part of the narrative that I hear is that the young folks are just really woke and buying into the climate scam and all this stuff. But I just saw that in the U.S., the 18 to 34-year-olds voted for Trump, which that makes me happy. But do you think the young folks or people in that age range in the UK are quite a bit more woke than that they would not consider voting for a Trump?
No, I think they would. I think they would vote for Trump. It's what they say publicly, and it's how they deal publicly and how bullied they are publicly. So I think reform also had a huge swing in the youth vote. And we have to hope that we get that in the next election. But that's 4 years away. A lot can happen in 4 years.
Yeah. So getting back to what Peter Ridd was saying recently, I think I've heard from him and other people that there's this vibe shift in most of the world that he's seeing in Australia, et cetera. But two standouts are the UK and Germany, that somehow they are still kind of the woke holdouts. Do you see any truth in that?
Yeah, I think that is completely true. I think that's completely true. And I think it's because, you know, the Labour government spread quite a lot of misinformation and perhaps some disinformation in order to get elected. We've had the same kind of policies for 14 years. We had a coalition with mental liberal Dems. So we became, or even our Conservative government became a little bit woke, which was disappointing for the majority of the UK. And I think where we find ourselves now is that we have this very hard, aggressive policy Labour government that is very socialist in outlook, but it lied to get elected. It just lied about many, many things in their manifesto. And what you're seeing in the UK at the moment is the institutions that are very liberal completely support what Labour's doing, forgetting entirely that the only reason they get paid is because the private sector props up the public service, right? Without the private sector, you don't have a public service. And the worse the economy gets, the worse the mood of the country gets. So people don't want to invest. They don't want to employ people because their taxes will be higher. They believe that there is two-tier policing. They believe their freedom of speech is being suppressed. Then that is not an environment for economic success. And once you don't have economic success and you get very miserable people, then you get very discontented people. And that, I think, is what we'll see happening over the next 4 years. And if that does happen, it will crush that progressive liberal dominance that we've seen for so long here.
Is there any dynamic where you can't say stuff that's true or you're might get arrested? But can you retweet something that's true, or what are the rules there? What do you think's happening there?
I don't know what the rules are. I honestly don't know what the rules are. If, for example, you were to say something about the ethnicity of rape gangs and say it all started by Pakistani rape gangs and they are all over Rotherham, we should do something about it, then that could be considered a race crime. And it could also be considered that you were trying to push violence. Yeah, you were trying to incite a riot. And yes, you could quite easily find the police at your door and arresting you for trying to incite violence. Now, do I think practically that would happen? Well, you'd like to think not, but then some poor young girl who, she's about 18, had some British I don't know what you call it, medieval helmet with horns on. And she'd written something on X. The police turned up and arrested her for being a far-right extremist because she had some Anglo-Saxon helmet on her shelf. I mean, that's happening here. How mental is that?
So is it all about using the term far-right? Is it that's constantly
Yes.
drummed in? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. So we don't talk about far-left extremism. We don't talk about Islamic extremism. The biggest problem in our country, according to this report by the Home Office, is far-right extremism, which, from what I've seen, is just mostly ordinary people being really discontented with what's happening in that country.
And the ordinary people know that, right? That this whole far-right thing is a bunch of BS? That
I think so.
it's propaganda? Yeah.
I think so. But, you know, I was told that if I had just held the conversation I had held in the pub, rather than putting it on X, then I wouldn't have been arrested. But Labour just brought in a new law, right, that says if you are sat in a group in a pub and you had said something like that, then that could be considered illegal. In which case, if anybody had overheard you and complained, that would be a non-crime hate incident. And also, the pub you were in would be liable for the offence caused to the employee or anybody else sat in a pub who overheard.
So this is competing for the craziest thing ever, I think, that you can't, no free speech in a pub. Is that going to become a law, or that's just some crazy proposal that could never? It actually is a law right now.
That is the law right now. And it's supposed to protect employees, but it doesn't. What it does is it turns employees into snitches, right? So you could have somebody working in a cafe who doesn't like what the two old ladies are discussing, and they can be reported for their conversation.
Yeah, the craziest thing ever. Are there any incidents now where this is actually happening, where a high profile that somebody's gotten into trouble for something they said in a pub yet?
I don't know. I don't know if there is yet. Oftentimes, these things don't really come into the public eye unless the police wants it to, which is what happened to me, of course. You would have to speak to someone like the Free Speech Union. Toby Young has probably got this huge list of people who he's looking after who have these ridiculous charges made against them for something they've said. Yeah.
So is Toby Young kind of a central figure in the Free Speech Union or free speech movement over there?
Toby Young set up the Free Speech Union, and he has done a fantastic job of helping people, particularly those people employed who are being disciplined or fired for opinions they have. So the opinion that a woman might have that says she does not think a man can turn into a woman. Well, we have had people who are fired for those beliefs. And Toby Young's Free Speech Union has done a great job.
So I'm curious, you can get in trouble for saying the wrong thing in a pub or saying the wrong thing on social media. But how about like the Daily Skeptic? Can they just say any true thing they want, or can they go to jail for speaking the truth?
So those people are really brave, and they do have the protection of journalism, right? And they are brave, but they also make their living out of saying what they believe. So they're not likely to lose their job for saying it. So people like the Daily Skeptic, you've got places like the Telegraph. Alison does a fantastic job. You've got Julia Hartley-Brewer also does a fantastic job, but they are protected within their realm of being journalists. We haven't got quite as far as imprisoning journalists yet.
Okay, that's a distinction I wasn't aware of. So they can say stuff that you can't say because you're not officially a journalist, so you have less protection maybe.
Well, anybody who is employed, if you work in a bank, then you can't say the types of things that the Daily Skeptic would say because you have no protection and you would probably lose your job. So I think it goes back to free speech is not free. It's how much are you prepared to pay for it?
Okay. I want to drop back to something you said about you cannot buy a knife on Amazon in the UK.
No, well, this is the new thing, right? So the attacks that have happened in Southport and the knife crime on the streets has been put down to how easily one can buy a knife. And of course, Amazon is at fault because they sell knives. So it's really great, though, for the government because they're trying to and have always wanted to bring in digital ID. Brilliant, brilliant. Now you can't buy a knife unless you've got two forms of identification. And digital ID would stop it all. We would have no knife crime in the UK if we had digital ID, right?
That's the thought. What is the gun control law? You can have a shotgun, you can't have a rifle or pistols in your country?
Yeah, that's right. So farmers can apply for shotguns. We have shotgun licenses on our farm, but the general public can't walk around and defend themselves with a gun. No, you see, the guns are all held by the criminals, which they're not allowed to do, but...
Do you think there might be any sort of a dynamic where the government doesn't mind some violence right now because that could help usher in digital ID?
No, I think the government is just incompetent. I think they're just utterly incompetent. And I think they're going around like whack-a-mole, hammering down anything that they possibly can as soon as a problem appears. But they don't want to talk about the real problem because then that would open them up to challenges from block voting by the Muslim vote. It would open them up to challenges from all over the place. So they won't do that. They don't want to rock the boat. They just want to shut everybody up.
So maybe we should talk a little about net zero because that is how I became such a big fan of your work, your pushback against net zero. I think you were maybe saying that some councils or the councils in total have spent tens of billions of pounds trying to prevent bad weather in 2075 or fighting the whole CO2 problem. Isn't that right?
Oh, yeah, it's completely bonkers. It's completely bonkers. So here you pay a council tax based on the band your home is in, the value of your home. And that is supposed to pay for local stuff, right? So your potholes, the lights on the street, pavements, social care, all that sort of thing. But if you come to the UK, you'll see that the state of our towns and the state of our roads is an absolute mess. A lot of it is because the councils have spent so much money decarbonising buildings. So they're spending huge amounts of money on DEI. They're spending huge amounts of money on net zero. And the taxes that we're paying aren't being spent on the things that we believed they were spending them on. So every year, they can only put taxes up by 5% unless they declare themselves bankrupt. And if they declare themselves bankrupt, well, now they can charge 25% higher. So in places like Birmingham, which declared itself bankrupt, after spending millions and millions on bonkers projects, DEI projects, and all kinds of crap that you would not choose to spend your taxes on, well, now they're going to put prices up by 25%.
So are they elected by voters who gave a big thumbs up? Let's spend all this money trying to prevent bad weather. Or this is kind of pushed on the councils from above again? Or how did this happen? This crazy stuff. How did it happen?
It's happened because of this ideology of progressive liberalism. That's how it's happened. And it's now ingrained through all of our institutions. All of our public service seems to have bought into this narrative of progressive liberalism. And during lockdown, of course, all of these people got 100% salary. Yeah, they worked from home, got 100% salary, but actually they had a net gain because they didn't have any transport costs to go to work either. So they all want to live this kind of luxury communist lifestyle where everybody lives together, cats and dogs living together, right? That's what they want. That's what they're setting out to achieve. And of course, it fails miserably because economically, it's total bollocks. Economically, we need more and more and more production. And if you look at the figures, productivity has fallen 9% since COVID, right? It hasn't got better. It's fallen, but their salaries have increased. So why work harder if you're just going to get more money anyway? And so they live in this sheltered bubble. Now, I'm generalizing. I am generalizing because obviously the entire country does not follow this doctrine of progressive liberalism, but so much of it does. And that is the real problem, is that they think that the general public are just idiots and they think that their way is the only way. And the only time this will completely collapse is when the economy is wiped out. And that's where we're getting to.
I mean, can they just blow all this money, go bankrupt, and then just fire it up again and start blowing the money again? Or,
yeah.
For now?
Isn't it?
Are you familiar with people like Rachel Matthews, who's been on my podcast, fighting back at the city council level? And on X, she's getting maybe millions of views just around the world. It's fantastic. She's doing a great job. They give her 2 or 3 minutes to speak, so she boils it down to just solid, just great stuff. And it's
Brilliant.
wonderful that
I'll
she's
have a look.
speaking the truth there. Yeah, it's great. It makes me happy.
I'll have a look. I think that traditionally in the UK, and what has enabled this, perhaps enabled this, is that local council meetings have traditionally, local parishes, local councils have traditionally had involvement from the older part of the population of their constituency. And that's because most younger people were working, right? So they can't get to meetings at 10:30 in the morning for coffee sandwiches and a debate on net zero, right? They can't get there. But now, as I say, they have been infiltrated by this much younger, progressive, liberal, very woke movement who is shifting the way these councils work and shifting the emphasis away from practical things into ideological things. And it's a complete and utter mess.
Can you tell us what's going on in Oxford with the 15-minute cities? Is actually going on right now where you get a certain number of credits or something? You can't travel anytime you want?
Well, a lot of the things that happened on X around that time were theoretical, brought in from reports and white papers that had been written by academic institutions and think tanks. A lot of that was drawn from reports and think tanks around the World Economic Forum, the UN, and other influential NGOs. And businesses that were members of those. And at the time, there was a report written by a very large engineering firm that had stated what the ideal would be. And the ideal would be that people would buy 3 pieces of clothing a year. They would have reduced their meat intake by 80%, and no one would have any cars, right? And that was exposed. People began to look into that. And that trail led to this thing called 15-minute cities. And that trail led to something called C40 cities. And they're all interwoven with the World Economic Forum's youth programs and how we will live in the future, which is fine. You can be a talking shop as long as you don't have influence over government, right? I don't care what you talk about, but as long as you don't have influence over government. And the problem is that because there are so many enormous businesses involved in these talking shops now, they see it as a way to shape government policy. And of course, that's what began to happen in places like Oxford, where the theory was, well, if we make all the streets one way, or we stop people traveling down these roads at certain times, then we will lower emissions, we will be good people, and we will keep our communities together. Only the problem is, this is England, right? I'm a chick. I don't want to cycle in the rain. Sorry, but I don't. And it rains quite a lot in the UK, right? So I'm not going to cycle anywhere. I want to choose whether or not I have my car. And of course, in small towns like that, the roads that were cut off were then not accessible by cars. So you couldn't go and collect anything. Well, they all started going bust. So that was a really shit idea. And although these things are all theoretically perfect, how can you have a 15-minute city where your GP surgery is 15 minutes away? I mean, how many more GPs would we need? It already takes a month to get an appointment and I have to drive to it. So it's just never going to happen. These are theoretical goals that we're never going to achieve. People don't want to talk about, and they don't want to practice in places like Oxford. They don't want to be the lab rat. It didn't work. It was crap.
Now, for this whole 15-minute cities thing, like you said, they never actually try to put more bowling alleys out there and make sure everybody has a bowling alley 15 minutes away. It's all about restricting your movement. Yeah.
And again, it's an economic issue. You know, one of the reasons we have huge out-of-town supermarkets is because it is more efficient to get food to a supermarket than to get food into a small 15-minute city, because you can't get your van in, you have to pay a fine to go in, and there are flower planters, so you have to walk your delivery to the greengrocers. Who's going to do that? The cost implications are enormous, which means the food's more expensive, and the whole supply chain falls down. And that's the problem with progressive liberalism, is that it is an ideological goal rather than a practical economic possibility. And that's my big problem with net zero. So, you know, in the history of the world, governments have never taken taxpayers' money and experimented with it. Let's just have a go at this, guys. Boom, if we win. You know, that doesn't happen. but it's happening right now. And in the UK, for Ed Miliband, who is a complete lunatic, to be spending £22 billion of UK taxpayers' money on experimental carbon capture that A, isn't needed, B, has not worked anywhere practically or financially anywhere in the world, is mental. And then to tell us that we can't do fracking, right? We're not allowed to do fracking, seismic activity. But carbon capture involves burying 30 million tons of CO2 per year. Well, that's a bit dangerous, don't you think? In fact, the most carbon ever buried was by Norway on a tiny project. They buried like 1 million tons. We want to do 30 million tons a year, right? But we won't frack. It's completely insane. Insane. The World Bank has just reported that Britain, the UK, has the least solar potential in the developed world, right? But apparently it's going to save us.
So do you see part of the problem of Miliband spending all this money is money printing, that they can just print money to and inflate the money supply? That's how I see it, that there's a lot of that going on in the U.S., that unlimited money is a big problem.
I think it's corporatism, right? So there is absolutely no way a corporate solar power business or a wind turbine business would invest in the UK unless it was guaranteed profit. And so what we've done, what Ed Miliband had, honestly, I think it's complete incompetence. What they've done is they've bribed people to come here. And they've come because taxpayers are paying them. So if you look at the wind situation in the UK, we have 11,000 wind turbines. They only work at between 8 and 20% because our grid is so fucked they can't take the energy. So what we do is we ask all those turbines to turn off. Now, because the companies that owned the turbines wouldn't make any profit in that period, worry not, we'll pay you. So last year, Britain paid £1 billion to turn off wind turbines. The whole thing is insane. Insane. We paid a company called Drax nearly £10 billion to provide biofuel. Do you know what biofuel means in the UK? It means we import wood pellets from virgin forests in Canada and in America that are owned by the company that owns the plant in the UK. Now, I don't know if they're doing this. I'm just saying, right? If this was me, what I would do is I'd own the company making the wood pellets, and then I'd sell them to the UK at a really high price because I wouldn't have to compete in my own market. I'd just sell them to the UK, and then I'd burn them. 7% of Britain's energy is produced by burning wood from Canada, which produces about the same emissions as coal. But we consider that green.
Yeah, they have to harvest the wood and process it and ship it across the Atlantic and all this stuff.
It's insane.
The payback
It's
is less bad weather in 2075, right? That's the big payback we get.
It's insane. It's completely insane. I can't think of one net zero policy in the UK that has any payback for taxpayers whatsoever. And it's our tax. And the mad thing is that, you know, we're voting every 5 years, and every government tells us they won't do this stuff. They won't waste our tax. They get in, they rip up the manifesto they were voted in on, and then they spend huge amounts of money that we don't have on net zero projects. It's insane.
Do you think there's progress being made on this whole globalist dream of a central bank digital currency where they can control all of what we're doing? You can't buy gas, you can't buy meat. Do you worry about that a lot?
I don't worry about it because I don't think we can stop it. I think it's coming. Absolutely, like a freight train. Digital ID first, then central bank digital currency. And then, as you know, we have this bloke called Chris Stark, who used to be the head of the Climate Change Committee, who was the advisory body to the government. Well, now he works actually with Ed Miliband in government. And one of the things he is on video as saying is that we if the carrot doesn't work, we will have to use the stick. And that type of personal carbon credit type blueprint, I think, is something that will happen, yes. Now, will it happen in 4 years before the next election? I don't think so, which means the next election, particularly for Britain, is incredibly important because whether you vote Tory or Labour, their policies will be the same. That is the direction of travel.
And you do think the overarching problem with the Milibands of the world is just incompetence? It's not that they're being controlled by evil geniuses or something?
I think it's a few things. I think it's complete incompetence, utter arrogance, career progressionism, and ideology. So I think they've been captured on a promise of, if you're not very bright and someone sits you down and tells you about this really fantastic thing that will save the world, then you might be quite keen on that, particularly if that person is very powerful, runs a very large business. I think they're just in the glare of the sparkly headlights of mixing it with the rich and famous and being very powerful. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that is part of the problem.
And it seems like the thought does not cross his mind that maybe this is all BS and it's all wrong. All this advice is crazy.
No, they're completely bought into this. Hook, line, and sinker, completely bought into it. Absolutely. I think they believe the things that are evidentially untrue. Evidentially untrue. They believe it. It's like the emperor's new clothes. I can see that the emperor is completely naked and they still think they're dressed and on their way to a party.
What comments do you have on the whole war on farmers? Do you think there is a war on farmers in Britain or not?
I think, again, as part of those 50-year policies and plans, these people are so arrogant, aren't they? They're so arrogant. I think they believe that consolidation will bring efficiencies and will increase food production. And they've been sold that line by the very corporates that will do that consolidating. So if you look at the UK, 72% of our farmland is owned by individuals and small farms. Only 12% of our farmland is owned by large corporations, which means it's amongst the last kind of industries that hasn't really been consolidated, and it's an enormous opportunity for huge corporates. And so I think the war on the farmers is more a kind of, I believe that the governments and the corporates think that this section of our country is a bit stupid, a bit backward. They're all old anyway. They need to get with the project. They need to get into the real world. That's what I believe they think. And don't forget, we went through this with supermarkets in the 70s. We used to have markets, we used to have grocers, then we had huge sheds, and everybody complains about it now. But at the time, it did create efficiencies. But as with anything in business, right, if it belongs to a few, it doesn't lower the price, it increases the price. So governments are being sold this line of, make the farms larger, consolidate the farms, have huge swathes of the countryside owned by corporates, and it will bring the prices down because they can invest in newer technologies, they can invest in new practices, they can do all these new things, and it will decrease the cost of food. That never happens. That never happens in a consolidated market. Prices go up because there's no competition, right? So our poor farmers are struggling under this huge dirge of regulations, new environmental regulations, the prices for seeds, the fact that seeds are regulated by four companies, that's it. Pesticides that they must use. They can't control anything within their own farms. And now they can't even leave them to their children. So yes, I do think there is a kind of a war on farmers. Do I believe it's a plan within government? No, I honestly think they're incompetent. Do I believe it's a plan higher up? Absolutely, because that's where the corporates are doing all their deal planning.
So switching gears here, do you have any sense as to how many people in the UK have climate change in their job description or in the name of their job? I see there's an association of climate change officers. Is it thousands of people? And what would happen if all of those people lost their jobs? What would happen to our climate?
It would be great. It would be great. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion, those jobs have to go. Look, the way I see it, I've been in business for a long time, and I understand what business does. If your job is not creating profit or supporting somebody else to create profit, there is no job. There is no job. And all of these management positions on climate change officer and net zero officer, it's just weight. It's just guff. And private businesses will have to get rid of them. Now, the problem in the UK is that we have some new regulations coming in that rather than lessen the burden on businesses will increase it, because from this year, in April, right, every business has to report on, I think it's 11, it could be 15, different net zero questions, right? Now, that means a small mechanic business, he employs 3 people. They work on cars all day, have to report to the government what they are doing to lower their carbon footprint in 15 sections. Well, first of all, he doesn't have time to do that, and he doesn't care anyway, right? All he cares about is being able to pay his staff at the end of the month. But that means he can employ a consultant, and that consultant then has to put the paperwork into HMRC for him. HMRC needs more people, right? It's just this massive growth and expansion in bollocks. And when you talk about just money turning, yes, so this whole new, there will be lots of green jobs is absolute rubbish. What there will be are lots of bean counters. And that's what we're seeing, this explosion in jobs that produce nothing, do nothing, just put restrictions on other people. That is not how you create an environment for growth in an economy.
But you do think that Britain has to wait a full 4 years for someone to come in and say, this is all BS, let's just slash it all at the government level?
I think that's going to, yes, this government won't do that. This government will not do that. It inherently believes in this complete rubbish, right? And it's from a socialist Marxist type doctrine anyway, which is very large government. So you've seen that our civil service has grown by about 600,000 people. I mean, it's enormous. So no, this government won't do anything. It won't slash anything. The question is, will this government last 4 years? And I think that's really going to be determined by either an external force, something goes wrong geopolitically, or an internal force, which is the economy absolutely collapses. We have to go to the IMF to try and bail us out. And that might have consequences for Keir Starmer. The problem is, who do you replace him with? Because you've only got people who are worse, if that was even possible. Right? I can't believe I just said that. Who do you replace him with?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll find out.
I mean, what do you think? Sat over there in the States, right? You're looking at the UK. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know at all. I'm so optimistic by what I'm seeing elsewhere is that this is kind of what they call a black pill, listening to how things are not going as well over there. But it just seems like there's that whole gradually, then suddenly thing where I think the climate scam may just collapse globally. I think it is, as we're looking at it right now. We got all these big banks that are leaving their coalition, and BlackRock saying basically, just kidding, we're not as into it. Yeah.
But do you think they are leaving those coalitions for PR purposes? Because I do. Because the investment is still very much in the green money. And the green money in the UK, as I've explained, is simply tax from people. Like, there's no businesses making any money. They're all subsidized. So I don't think necessarily they're pulling. I think they're just changing their PR.
So the money is still flowing the same way. It's just the PR. Maybe it is. I don't know.
Well, why would the money stop? If the money is always guaranteed a return because taxpayers are funding you, why would the money ever stop? I'll give you another, for instance. In the UK, there's this huge drive through government to push smart meters. And that is done ostensibly to manage electricity usage with it. Look, I see the point of it. I don't think it's an alarmingly stupid idea, but I think it's an alarmingly stupid idea, right? Because once you give someone else the control of your energy in your house, then you lose control of when you want to turn it on and off, right? But put that to one side. BlackRock now owns 40% of the smart meter market, which the government has insisted must cover every household. Now, not only is that a cost to the homeowner, but they also pay for absolutely nothing whatsoever, nothing whatsoever, £11 a year because it's just there, And that adds up to like £4-5 billion in the pockets of BlackRock for doing absolutely nothing, except telling the government that they really should insist people have smart meters, right? So no, I don't think the banks are pulling out. I think the banks and the investors will go where the money is. And the money currently in the UK is from subsidies.
Very interesting. I'm learning a lot here. We're coming up to the end of our hour here. Any other points you'd like to make?
Yeah, I mean, what do you envisage happening in the UK? What do you think is going to happen to us as an outsider? You've seen what's going on in the UK. Do you think it's mad? Do you think, I'm quite interested in the perspective of what Americans think of what's happening here.
Yeah, so my personal perspective, it looks just absolutely insane, just incredible amounts of insanity. And I'm an optimist in general that this insanity cannot continue forever. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I do think that there's a great awakening happening across the globe, and I think it's going to happen there too. So I'm optimistic. There may be, I think Edward Dowd says there's bad times coming, but after those, there are good times coming. I think he might be right that, yeah, there might be some really bad things still to come, but I am very optimistic 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now, things will be better.
Well, let's hope so. Let's really hope so.
We'll see. All right. Thank you very much for doing this. Bernadette Spofforth, I hope to talk to you again. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.